Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of the Xander Drew series and founder at Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. All right. Thank you for joining me for a special episode of the Write Project podcast. I know that I say every episode of the Write Project podcast is special, but this one really is. We are on the line with Kerri Cull, the amazing author of Rock, Paper, Sex and the newly released Rock, Paper, Sex Trigger Warning. Thank you for joining me, Kerri.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. Okay. First things first. Rock, Paper, Sex was an amazing success and it was on everyone's reading list. I saw it everywhere. It was a daunting, crazy, oh my God, like Harry Potter levels of locally,
Yeah.
It took me a long time to read it because like people kept being like, have you read Rock, Paper, Sex? And I was like, I started to be like, no, stop asking me. I'm not going to read it now. So it took me forever to read it for that reason, because I'm a
good grudge read.
yeah. Because everyone asked. And I got the second one there. First of all, like what was the impetus behind the sequel? Is it more specific, or was it a need to zoom in on certain areas, or more story to tell, more stories coming forth?
Yeah, kind of all of that. So in the first book, Rock, Paper, Sex, Volume 1, I covered a lot of different area, but I didn't cover all of the areas that I wanted to cover in regards to themes and subject matter. So that was one of the reasons I really felt like there were a lot of other stories out there that I needed to include in order to do this topic justice, because it is so nuanced and varied, depending on so many different factors for the different participants. That was one reason why I decided to do it. When I started, or when I first published the first volume, I had no intention of really doing a second volume until a couple months passed, and I was like, you know what? I didn't really do this topic justice. I really need to go back and fill in some blanks and add some more context in regards to what people are going through and experiencing. So the second book is a little darker.
That's the name.
Yeah, the second book has some different types of stories, some of the same stories. There are some follow-ups from people from the first book, which is really fun. But it covers kind of a wider range of topics, and kind of gets into a little bit of a different side of the sex industry here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And of course, the big timestamp on trigger warning is that I did most of the research during the pandemic and during the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a little bit of a timestamp on that book in regards to how the world was operating, and different challenges that come into play there were different challenges for everybody, and sex workers included in that, right? And what that looked like for them. And also I found that, a third reason, I guess, why I did the second book is because I found that after I wrote the first book, and this was not my intention, but after I wrote the first book, I found that topics about sex work, human trafficking, consent, all of these different topics became much more normalized. So people were talking about them on a daily basis. And I don't feel like that was really happening in the general population in Newfoundland and Labrador at that time. I feel like since Volume 1 came out in 2017, the conversation has changed exponentially. And I even now read some things that I've said in the first volume. I'm like, oh, that sounds so dated, right? But I think that's a good thing, because that shows that everyone is learning, and I'm learning, and opinions are changing, and all of that sort of stuff. So I guess that's kind of the three reasons why I did that second book.
That makes sense. So, and I've definitely seen the conversation about this, at least, maybe not, I don't think I've seen it change, because I wasn't as dialed into it before the publication of Rock, Paper, Sex. And this has been a big part of, like, in the province, it being opened up. But I've definitely seen it talked about more, like noticing it more, and people talk And after everyone read the book, everyone kind of became an armchair expert. Like, oh, I have read Rockford. Let me interject you into this conversation that we're having right now. But have you received any pushback? I've heard a couple opinions, not ones that I share, but like I won't name call people or anything like that. But there's a few times when like I've been at things and your name and your book wasn't named, but it's very like stating opinions that are just like people talking about the glorification of the industry and stuff, and I'm like,
Right.
pardon you, what the holy hell, you know what I mean? I'm wondering if you've gotten any of that after the first book, or
I didn't really get any of it to my face about that. But, to be fair, there are a lot of stories in that book that are pro sex work. That is 100% true. And I think the reason why that is because it's a lot easier for people to talk about stories that are positive in their personal life. No one wants to publicly put stories out there that are traumatizing and re-traumatizing, and stories that really maybe where they may be looked at in a different light or a negative light. So those stories are much more challenging to get, and it takes a lot more for people to be empowered by their vulnerability. That's a really hard place for people to get to. So I get that there have been opinions about that, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the second book. Going back to what I said before, is that I feel like I did need to include some various perspectives on that, right? And also too, about the first book, there were two stories that, people really want their own opinions and their own assumptions to be fed and acknowledged when they're reading something like this. And if those opinions and assumptions are not, they somehow feel like they don't know what they're talking about. Yep. And that's not a nice thing either. Right. So it's just like when we look for something online, what we're seeking, we find, right? So if someone's reading a book and they're looking for a particular stance and they don't find it, and it's the stance that they have, they're not going to connect with that in the same way. But there were two stories that I guess were more along the lines of the stereotypical, like, violent ridden stories, I think, that people were kind of maybe looking for in the first book that I didn't include. One is I had them written. I worked with the participants. Both of those participants gave me consent. However, I got the impression that consent was given when they were under the influence. So therefore, they did not give true consent. So I did not include those stories because of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah. No. That's. Yeah. Absolutely. Definitely.
One of them did make it into the sequel. The other one did not.
Okay. Sounds good. So not to spoil anything from trigger warning now, but if this took place, a lot of the research during the pandemic, I'm going to show how naive I am right now and ask, did sex work continue during the pandemic?
Sex work did continue during the pandemic in regards to people doing their own personal escorting. Sex work did not continue as it would out of dance bars, like the Cotton Club or whatever, right? Obviously, bars like this had to shut down and abide by all of the provincial regulations that were coming out. What that did, though, was drive more people into kind of doing sex work. So if someone was only dancing, they might have then found that they needed to kind of foray into a different avenue of sex work in order to pay their bills and so on. So that was one of the things that kind of happened. But yeah, it did definitely still go on. It seemed like there was a lull in it at the beginning because COVID was so new and no one really knew what it was and how serious it was. But generally speaking, it did continue, but just not in the public eye like it normally would. I mean, some people don't consider dancing or stripping as sex work. Some people do. That's a little bit of a controversial topic as well amongst dancers. But for this conversation, we will put that into the sex worker.
That's fair.
Yeah,
that's fair.
And of course, massage parlors had to shut down as well. So a lot of people went to online platforms then to create content and sell their content that way.
Things like I assume like OnlyFans and its different forms. The different permutations of that stuff like that. Okay. I had never even it didn't occur to me that someone being like, again, the club being shut down resulted in like, oh, those people have to go then continue their work somewhere else, possibly somewhere they wouldn't have wanted to. That is a problem.
It's definitely a problem. And I mean, people are going to make money how they need to make money when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, right? So and a lot of some people were comfortable with that and some people were not. So
I'm just picturing like, and you're right, a moment ago you mentioned that like some people draw the boundary of what they would call sex work in different ways. I'm definitely one of the people who wouldn't like call like stripping or anything like that sex work, anything that's within the permits of that. But that's neither here nor there, you know what I mean? That's just a very fine line of where you draw the terms in your own line. But I'm trying to picture during the pandemic, not that it's easy for me to picture this either way, but I'm trying to picture, you usually picture like, okay, there's a guy and he's hiring someone or whatever, and they go, but he can't leave. It's during the pandemic. I'm trying to picture someone like bringing someone back, calling and bringing someone back to his family home. Like, I have no idea how the heck this would work during the pandemic. Like, honey, don't come downstairs. What's happening?
Well, I mean, some sex workers doing calls, and they have people come to their home. People can still rent hotels, things of that nature, right?
Yeah. What, in your opinion, so you've done a lot of research on this, you've talked to people, what I have to ask, because I mean, like, and I'm sure you draw conclusions like this in the books and stuff like that, but like, as someone who's talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, because I have no knowledge about this whatsoever. But like, in your opinion, what are like the number one things that we can do to make the industry safer for the people who work in it? Because you must notice things like that. You know what I mean?
So one of the things that I would do, and one of the things I think that is happening right now, just kind of naturally and organically, is that conversations around sex work and human trafficking are being normalized. People are talking about, consent, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, rape, exploitation, stigma, whorephobia, all of these things more now than I especially in Newfoundland and Labrador, more than I've ever experienced. So I think that is kind of the first step, is making people comfortable with the conversations and the language and all of that. The second thing would be really looking at the laws that currently exist in Canada when it comes to sex work and human trafficking. And, sex work and human trafficking is so intersected that this is where the crux of the problem lies, is that when we're looking at these things together, they are so very different, but there is a very thick intersection, which makes writing these kind of cut and dry laws very, very difficult. So I get why, nothing has really been done to change this, because it's a really hard task. And Bill C-36 got royalist sent back in 2014. And so basically it is legal to sell sex services as long as those services are your own, but it is illegal to purchase. So that's where the laws are now. So as you can see, that creates quite a conundrum for people in regards to safe sex work. Now, the other issue on that as well is that, wherever there is independent sex work, whether it's on, websites that are selling sex work, or whether it's, on the street corner and everything in between, there's also that human trafficking component where there are people being victimized. So it's really hard to approach that topic as one topic when they are very different. But I said there's a very thick intersection, but then there are all these other variables within those topics. So I don't know the answer to what the law should be or how it should be written or all of that, but I think it definitely needs to be revamped in consultation with sex workers, with survivors of human trafficking, and with the people who are affected by these laws. So that's kind of the second thing, is kind of re-looking at the legislation and the criminal code and really thinking about how it's affecting the people that are involved and how to put safer measures in place for the people who need it. So yeah, I think the normalization of the language and the conversations, the laws. What are some of the other things? I think those are two of the big things, to be honest. I'm sure other things will come to mind when we get off this call.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Where I'll be like, oh yeah, I should have said that. But and just, when I've been talking to people about all of this stuff over the past, 8 years now, 7 years, people are really afraid to offend. They're really afraid to say the wrong thing. The language is very political. People are afraid to talk about it, especially in public forums where you're going to be recorded, or there's an audience with people with varying opinions and experiences and assumptions. And I think that's something we really have to try to get over as well. It's like, people are going to say the wrong thing sometimes, and sometimes that's okay. When we're all learning. And I mean, I think it's easy to tell when someone comes from just a place of ignorance where they don't know the word, or they can't find the word, and a place of ignorance that is actually hateful.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference there. So I think that we really need to kind of cut people some slack when they're trying to wrap their heads around these sorts of things. And people need to not be afraid to express their opinions and ask questions in order to be more informed.
Yeah. If there was a t-shirt that I could wear that would get me out of most of the trouble I get in my life, it would say, I'm not hateful, I'm stupid, on it. Because that people knowing about me right off the bat would solve a lot of the problems I get into.
A lot of people are like that. I mean, a lot of people have a really hard time even formulating politically correct questions when they don't know anything about the topic they're supposed to be asking questions or thinking about. And this language is very political, and there are so many different players. And you talk to, like, for instance, we talked about stripping. You talk to one stripper or dancer, they may be fine with the sex worker label. You talk to another one and they are not, and they find it offensive, right? So that's just a kind of a simple example of that.
And there's also like a weird. You talked briefly. I made some notes on my hand because I'm like that. I don't waste paper when we were talking. But one of the things was getting comfortable talking about all these things, sex work and all the things around it. There's a weird, like, even now I find myself stuttering a bit because there's a bit of like Nan's ghost in the back of my head going, oh, we don't talk about that. Like, I'm trying to ask the conversation as like restrictions that my Nan's raising got put in goes, no, shut your mouth. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. I mean, you should have seen it when I told my parents about this project. Like, they were like, you're doing what now? Like, it's like, yeah, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've heard it all for sure.
Yeah. But that's true. I remember reading a book by a fiction book by Wayne Johnston, The Divine Ryans, one of my favorite.
Divine Ryans.
Yeah, one of my favorite
Love
books.
Wayne Johnston.
Yeah, to ever come out of this province. But there's a scene where the little boy's walking with his Nan and the main character, and they walk past a dog that is like aggressively humping a fence. And the little boy goes like, "Hey, what was that? Let's talk about that." And the Nan goes, "What dog? There was no dog there." And just this very Newfoundland thing of, we don't talk about that. We pretended it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And like, you can't have a conversation about how to make things better if you can't even have a conversation about how it exists. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And like, one of the things that I learned doing the first book was that there are people in my personal life and relationships who are sex workers, and I did not know it until I started doing the research. And you can imagine what I was like as a writer, because the reason why I got into this topic didn't really have anything to do with sex work and human trafficking at the beginning. It had to do with me being interested in people's stories and wanting to help people tell stories. And I wanted to find a topic that was very interesting to me, but very confusing and very provocative. And I did a writer's workshop for a week. And Gerard Collins was my mentor at the time. And he said, you need to write about what makes you ask questions. You need to write about what really gets you going and what you don't know anything about, and dive into it. And so that's one of the reasons why I started in this topic. And of course, as soon as it was out there that I was looking for these stories, it wasn't hard to get them, especially not for the second book. The first book was a little bit harder in regards to how I got the stories and stuff, but people really wanted to be involved in it and to tell their stories, right? But my point is that when I found out that a couple of people that I know were actually selling sex, I was floored. I was absolutely floored. So that kind of sweep it under the rug, silence, let's not talk about these things that are uncomfortable, that we, especially if you're of a certain age, growing up in Newfoundland, you're kind of used to experiencing that, just creates more stigma for individuals when they're adults and they're, engaging in certain activities, or they are, say, they've been victimized in some way and they feel that some of that blame is on them, and all of that stigma kind of just becomes theirs. And I think that it kind of starts, or that action of our parents and our grandparents and so on, not talking to us about things and kind of sweeping under the rug, that kind of has strengthened that sort of stigma for people who are in these situations and in these types of industries now.
That makes sense. Yeah. You also talked about the difference between, or briefly alluded to the distinction between sex workers that work for themselves and ones that are being exploited. That there's someone. So, how do I say this, in the supply chain up above? You know what I mean? So, trying not to use language that I can't use on CHMR.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and yet correct me if I say anything that you can't use either. And I'll find another way to say it. But so one of the big themes that I found by interviewing all of these people is that most of them agree that this sort of work should not have a boss. And the moment that it has a boss is when stuff starts to go awry. The moment, because we're talking about the commodification of sex, right? And we're talking about autonomy and sexual autonomy, and it's mostly women's bodies and the commodification of women's bodies that we're talking about. And there for someone like me, I've never been a sex worker, I've never been involved in it. I do not have any first person experience doing that, so my opinion is not the one that matters. The opinions that matter are the ones in the books and everyone else who is involved in that. But it seems like there is a prevailing agreement that this is the type of work that should not have a boss. And the people who are doing the selling should be able to say when, where, what they do, how they do it, and they should be able to keep all of their own money. Now there's also a line of thinking where people want to hire security guards. People would rather work in a massage parlor to make sure that they are safe. So it's not everyone not everyone has the same experience or the same viewpoints. Generally speaking, though, everyone who I've spoken to, with the exception of just a couple, feel that it's not the sort of thing that should have a boss.
Can I ask you, and it's okay if you don't know the answer to this, but when this subject's come up with another author, the one that I got a lot of pushback from, the main pushback from this person, very, very vitriolic, was that there's, again, I don't agree with this person, but they pushed back that the narrative was that of those two camps, like they're either equal or that there is more people working for themselves, when according to this human, it's the other way. It's like, no, like we paint this picture, but it's 99.9 people that are being exploited, people that have a boss and it's being exploited. And this tiny sliver that we pick out, that is that from your experience, What's the weight between those two versions of the industry?
I feel like it depends on what your definition of exploitation is.
Yep.
There are definitely pimps and people who are being trafficked here in St. John's and over Newfoundland and in Labrador. 100% there is that presence here. Obviously, not as much as a bigger center, but it is definitely happening here. I defer to the participants. And so, for instance, if I'm talking to a participant who works at a massage parlor and she is, her story is that she is an independent sex worker. She happens to work at a massage parlor. Someone else may look at that and say that she is getting exploited, but she does not consider herself she doesn't consider herself as being exploited. So I take that at face value. I'm not going to put an assumption on that says, oh, you think that, but you're wrong. It's just very patronizing and not conducive to understanding and meeting people where they're at and harm reduction and all of those other things that I believe in, right?
There was a level of that in that conversation where it was like, no, I can tell when people are being exploited. I'm like, can you?
Yeah, and I mean, people do have their own, there are varying definitions of exploitation. And like I said, I do defer to the participants. There is, that experience that happens where someone is in sex work for however long, and, they are in sex work on their own accord. And then, 2 years later, they look back and they realize that they were being exploited. That definitely happens. Yep. I mean, I don't have any numbers. I can't say with certainty, like the individual you're talking about with numbers, but I can say that definitely does happen as well.
Yeah. And I don't mean to say, I'm not meaning to engage in hearsay here where I'm not trying to do the Donald Trump thing where it's like some people are saying, I'm trying not to bring in a third party that's not here into this thing. That was a weak conversation with that person that ended in yelling on both sides.
Well, people are entitled to their opinions about things, and I think that having the conversation, even if you disagree with the person, is valuable. I guess the problem with that sort of stuff is that really when it's between people who, just like you and I, when it's between people who have no stake in it, then we really don't know what we're talking about, in regards to the topics. And really, that's why in the books, I put so much emphasis on the participant's voice. So if you read the books, it's very quote heavy. It's not me paraphrasing and things like that. It is very, very quote heavy because I really want the participant's voice to be strong. And I really want their voice to be heard, right? And they are the experts in their lives and their experiences, not me, not you, not any of these people on the sidelines. We can certainly talk about it, and we're varying levels of knowledge and things like that, but we are not the people who are the people with lived experience, whether that's whether that's human trafficking related or whether that is independent escort related.
Yeah, and like we said, I don't. My stupidity does not get corrected unless I speak out loud, and then someone corrects me. You know what I mean? Like if I didn't open my mouth and say stupid things, I would just live in ignorance forever.
And I mean, getting back to like what I said, like if before, it's okay to have a conversation about these things and educate each other in various ways, right?
Excellent.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.